That's good. Well, hello there. Welcome to Blackballed. My name is James D7. I have a funny story before we start about my next guest. His name is Professor Larence Krauss. I've been watching him for years. I started watching him a long time ago when I was really into Hitchens, actually, as an atheist at the time, and I'm still an atheist, just not as militant, or maybe more so. We'll find out. But I was thinking about all the preparation work I should do for someone like Larence Krauss because I'm not an academic. I dropped out of college. I had to look up the meaning of physics before I started this interview, and I took that as a sign that I should just stop and maybe I can learn something instead of just doing an interview pretending that I could scratch the surface of anything that my next guest can talk about. Professor Larence Krauss, welcome to Blackballed.
It's nice to be with you, at least virtually.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit a couple weeks ago. And you were taking a road trip. Can we start with that? Because I'd love to know what made you decide to take a road trip in a pandemic.
Well, it's great if you don't interact with people. And that's the good thing about a road trip is that you're just in your car. And in this case, we were in two cars, but we're traveling across the country. Well, we just 4,200 miles. From West Coast, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, literally, and with a cat and a dog, and it was quite an adventure. And every place was different, and it's hard to believe it all succeeded. The hardest part was getting into Canada, and maybe the hardest part. And I'm very happy to say that we did. And I'm here now. We're in Canada. There's Canada behind me.
Yeah, you're in Prince Edward Island, you said, yeah?
Yeah, I'm in Atlantic Canada right now. Yep.
Okay. And have you been there before? Is this something you normally do, or?
I've been here. Last time I was here was many years ago. So it's great to be here now.
I've always wondered if Americans can feel that barrier of politeness when they cross the border. Like once they're across, does it become like, wow, the socialism is really in the air here. I can feel it pretty well.
Well, look, first of all, I grew up in Canada, so you know, it's not. But the crossing the border was cathartic, and it was lovely, and it's great to be in Canada right now. But the you know, the differences are sometimes subtle. But I've, you know, having lived in both countries for long periods, I know the differences, and I know the positives and negatives, and I've also learned everyone should live in two countries because the illusion that one country is better than any other place in the world quickly disappears if you actually live in more than one country. There are good things or bad things about every country, and therefore I have no sense of nationalism in that sense. But I am happier. I believe I'll be happier now in Canada than in the U.S. right now. Mm-hmm.
Is this permanent then, or are you just sort of splitting your time still?
Well, the moving back to Canada is I expect will be permanent, and at some level, yeah, and absolutely, I intend to relocate to Canada. Yes.
Okay. So let's get started here. So I do watch a lot of clips of people discussing topics that I don't understand because I want to learn more. Like I feel a little bit like a monkey when I listen to people talk about science, especially. It bothered me in grade 10 or grade 9, whenever it was, when my instructor told me that the table that he was knocking on was actually made of molecules.
Most space. Did he tell you
Well,
that?
yeah, he probably did. And I just went, okay, like I need a little bit more time to understand this. But I never really got past that part of it because I couldn't conceptualize something at such a microcosmic level or such like a molecular state, you know? And then when you read or when you listen to people like yourself speak, it doesn't feel like boring science. It feels like magic. It does. Like, you know, when I listen to you talk about it, when I listen to Tyson talk about, you know, the cosmos and things like that.
Sorry, switch the video. We were using the wrong camera. That's a much better camera. Sorry, go on.
That's okay. So yeah, so I mean, give us what would you say the best piece of advice would be for someone who's, you know, say in their 40s, someone like myself, who feels like they know almost nothing? What is the starting point for that guy to start learning about things like physics?
Ask questions. That's the starting point of all knowledge, is to ask questions. And not knowing things is exciting because it means there's the opportunity to learn things. So ask questions and then try and explore for the answers. And in some cases, that means going and carefully choosing through the web to see and comparing different results, because you shouldn't. The web is such that it's a source of great information, but also a source of great misinformation, or doing experiments or testing. And so simply accept. I mean, the great thing about being a scientist, in my experience, is that you realize the more you know, the more you don't know. And so the vast amount about the world that needs to be yet understood, that isn't understood, is tremendous. And I find that empowering and exciting and enlivening. And so just asking questions is the beginning of knowledge. And that's why I get so upset when I see institutions or people or groups that are forbidding people from asking questions, whether it's religious or secular.
Yeah, and if the more you know, the more you don't know. Philosophically, that's a decent argument for being sort of less of an atheist, the more you learn. And I'm playing my own devil's advocate because I'm an atheist, but I'm just the way you phrase it.
That's the problem with religion. It assumes the answers before it asks the questions. The answer is there is a God, and therefore everything has to be interpreted in terms of that answer. But that's exactly the wrong way of doing things. The real question is, you better ask, what's the evidence? And so assuming you have the answers before you ask the questions is the antithesis of learning. It's the opposite of learning.
I remember back in let's say since the turn of the millennium, where it seemed like everybody was like, the atheism was the fastest growing belief or non-belief, in North America, certainly in Europe, I think, for a time. And I've noticed lately a big kind of shift in the last 4 or 5 years, where it's not just religion that might be becoming more popular. I'm not really talking about the establishment kind, but the sort of new age religions. I'm seeing it everywhere. And I'm seeing people worship crystals and things like that. And I'm wondering if we're getting into an age where we're filling the void left by institutional religion with things equally absurd or equally, say, unprovable, or some other offensive term I could come up with.
I think the point is that religion obviously serves an evolutionary need or niche, fills an evolutionary niche. It's probably a better way of putting it. And people want to believe, in the words of Fox Mulder, and at the same time, the kind of fairy stories of conventional religion are, as people begin to ask questions about them, the ridiculousness of all of the fairy tales behind all of the world's major religions becomes more evident. But people still want to believe in things that the world, the universe is good or somehow cares about them, and we all want to believe that. And so there's a natural tendency to fall into some kind of hocus pocus, whether it's organized religion or something else. And that's what science is based on, the fact that we all want to believe. And it's built up a series of mechanisms to overcome that, to say, hold on, question yourself, test your hypotheses. So if we didn't want to believe in nonsense, then we wouldn't need science as a tool to help guide us through that natural human tendency to want to believe.
I find it interesting that science might allow us to break away from religion if these UFO footage pieces that they're leaking from the Pentagon turn out to be not of this world, right?
Well, they aren't. Don't worry about it. They aren't not of this world, and there's no evidence that they are. And the least, as I was just saying to someone else on a broadcast, as Richard Feynman used to say, that UFOs are clear evidence of known human irrationality rather than unknown alien rationality. And so the point is, the UFOs are unidentified flying objects. That means we don't know what they are. But the least likely of all possibilities, and I mean that in a clear sense, the least likely possibilities is that they're alien. So just, any other possibility, regardless of how absurd, is more likely than they're being alien based.
So if the footage isn't doctored or anything, you think that the most likely answer is that America, China, Russia, someone has tech that no one else has? Is that the idea?
I have no idea, or whether it's misinterpretation of the footage, incorrect data, experiments are wrong. Maybe. So there's lots of possibilities, and I don't know the answer. But that's okay. But not knowing the answer, it's like saying, I think I quoted somewhere saying, lack of understanding is not evidence for God. It's evidence of lack of understanding. And I think in the case of UFOs, you can say the same. Lack of understanding of UFOs is not evidence for aliens. It's evidence of lack of understanding.
So then the greater question becomes, why would the government be releasing this footage and saying it's inconclusive now?
Well, because there's so much pressure, and there's a few probably Congress people who have UFO fixations. And I mean, it's, I think the point is that it's so long past that and it's there and probably has leaked to a variety of set of sources. So rather than be behind the leaks, they want to be in front of the leaks. But as far as I know, and I read a recent news report on it, the report will come out saying there's no evidence that this is any alien technology. We just don't know what it is. And there are speculations about what it might be. But I suspect the reason it's being released is that it was some Congress people were going to release it anyway.
Yeah, I heard that there were people that were afraid that Trump would leak a bunch of secrets about their UFO file, so they just preempted him.
Perhaps. I'm glad it didn't come out during. Well, yeah, I'm glad it didn't come out during the Trump period, because you never know what he would have said and then what people would have believed. Because virtually everything that was released during that time that came out of his mouth was misinformation.
Yeah, no, we know. We know. That was a bizarre chapter for Canada, looking sort of like at the United States.
World. I mean, the United States influences Canada and the rest of the world, and it was a bizarre chapter of the world. Unfortunately, what it also appeared is that it was the kind of lack of the kind of misinformation and the fake reality was not limited to the United States. It's happening around the world.
Yeah, I mean, it was a strange thing to just witness, because I've been traveling to America my whole life. I've lived there before. I love Americans. I think they're one of the most hospitable people, really, when it gets down to it. I've driven across the country. All I ever experienced was really friendly, kind Americans. And I've always been sort of, over the last decade at least, under this fear that our ideologies are going to trump our ability to sort of like, separate fact from fiction. And I think that the
basis, I mean, that's what ideology is. Ideology is the definition of ideology, is, if you wish, is to trump fact with fiction. Because ideology says there's some things that cannot be questioned. And the minute you do that, you're departing from reality.
I guess what I was going to ask is, if a post-America, if that is sort of like the bookmark for the beginning, or the punctuated beginning of every administration being exactly like that. Like, I found Obama's to be a similar but more civil, because Obama could never do anything wrong as far as the center left was concerned. He could drone 7 countries at once and everyone would just be like, meh, and so there was a blank check syndrome that was certainly existed under Obama, extended to Trump. I'm sure it's there with Biden. And is this it now? Is that what we're doing?
Well, I think anytime, look, I mean, democracy requires an informed electorate and informed public. So anytime that there's misinformation, I mean, all governments try and misinform in order to remain more popular. And I think that people, what we're seeing is people not educating themselves because the internet can be an echo chamber, and so misinformation is more easily purveyed and conveyed that in via the internet than it was before. And so what we really need to do is train young people, especially because older people are lost causes in this regard. I think, is to try and sift the wheat from the chaff, and when it comes to the internet. But you're right. I mean, every administration to one extent. I think Trump was quantitatively and perhaps even qualitatively, qualitatively different than other administrations. But they all distort the facts in their own favor. It's all of us do in many cases, and in human communication, is such a natural tendency. But we're the explicit use of lying about extreme levels of lying and repeating those lies. I think we're seeing that. Unfortunately, we saw that with Trump, and I think we're seeing that in some ways more prominently. And people can more effectively control the media, and by the media now, one means the internet to some extent than was possible before. And all of those things require that we have a responsibility as citizens in a democracy to be more diligent in being skeptical and checking our sources. Ultimately we get the government, I suppose, we deserve.
Yeah, that's more than fair. And before January 6th, I actually was thinking that the United States was within a few years of maybe even some sort of civil war between the fringes of the left and the right. And then I saw what happened on January 6th, and although I think it was abhorrent what happened, I don't think they're sending their best and brightest to the front lines. these fringes. So I'm not worried about a civil war anymore, because I'm like,
about that in a variety of areas. The best and brightest are being kept out of many things, and it's of some concern. I'm a big believer in meritocracies, and I'm a big believer in democracy too. But when it comes to certain institutions, I believe that they should be meritocracies, not democracies. And but when it comes to elected officials, it should remain a democracy, and we get the government we deserve.
Yeah, you have a big slate of celebrities that are apparently tinkering with the idea of running in the next presidential election.
Celebrities, yeah, because the bigger the Twitter base you have, I suppose, the better your likelihood of being elected. It's again, that's not new as well. Look at Ronald Reagan. I mean, anyway,
he speaks like a statesman, at least, Reagan, right?
What was that?
I said he's got that veneer, right? Reagan, he had that veneer where he spoke like a statesman. He was acting like a statesman.
Yeah. He was an actor, right? He wasn't a very good actor, but he was good enough to act his way into the presidency.
Yeah, my favorite fun fact of Reagan is that wasn't he a union head at one point?
He was, before he both busted unions. He was, the Screen Actors Guild, I think. And I think even when he was head of that, I think he effectively helped use it to quash people. It was probably after the communist scare, but I think he was certainly part of that, involved in sort of since that's the title of your podcast, in blackballing people.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason why it's called that, because most of my guests have been blackballed at one time or another. We do live in that kind of cultural war times, I guess. And it's funny because I think that I've never seen such an issue like this before, because the arbitrary cancellation of people for tweets that are 10 years old, for example, it's got to be like, I think there was a New York Magazine poll that was done, and it was all about political correctness. I think it was about a year ago. And it was like widespread, 75% of people just didn't like this game anymore, didn't like the PC stuff, didn't like cancel culture. Minorities don't like it more than white people don't like it. Or sorry, minorities are not among the pile of that support cancel culture, which was surprising to a lot of people. So it turns out it's the kind of white Brooklyn liberals again that are speaking on behalf of others.
Fortunately, it's the people whose political leanings traditionally have been closer to my own who have been letting ideology get in the way of reality, and that's unfortunate. And therefore, I've been called many things. I was just talking to another broadcaster about this. In my life, I was labeled a social justice warrior once for something I wrote, and then and then I now been called a right-wing pundit. So I don't know what. It's unfortunate that the left, in my mind, is responsible for a lot of infringement on free inquiry and thinking and the imposition of ideology. And I find it disturbing only because politically, my political leanings have traditionally been those of the left.
I think I say the same, because I think the most common position to be in right now is to be sort of a left or a moderate lefty or whatever, believe in man-made climate change, anti-war, pro-societal safety net, all the big checkpoints. And then you get to the one that sort of has to do with identity politics, and that's it. That's the only thing that can define you now as a progressive, is if you sort of parrot those beliefs. I have a theory. I don't know if you think it will be a good theory or not, but the N-word theory. So society naturally progressed into such a way where we believe, and I think rightfully, that white people saying the N-word is something that we shouldn't do. We just collectively have an instinct that is the correct way to go about it. But I think they're applying, when I say they, I mean like that fringe to the left, they're applying the N-word standard to everything now. So like they view it through such a profoundly serious lens. And we're talking about things like trans issues, things like that, like if you don't believe kids should have hormone blocker or puberty blockers, then you're transphobic. You might as well be saying the N-word over there. And I think that's crazy that we are.
Look, I wrote a piece for Quillette. One of the reasons I get called right wing is I sometimes write for Quillette, among other things, talking about making the profane sacred. And that's the whole point. Words shouldn't be sacred. And by word, Yahweh, I mean, in the Jewish religion, you couldn't say the name of God, right? Because it was dangerous, and that was a sacred word. You can use it. That's the beginning of this kind of nonsense. And words are words. And when I was a kid, they used to say sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. And of course, things can be hurtful. And we recognize things can be hurtful, but giving them a sacred notion is so that anytime they're used, lightning strikes down is just ridiculous. And the example that I can think of that's the most ridiculous version of that was and I wrote about this, was a New York Times science reporter who got removed from the New York Times for using the N-word to tell someone they shouldn't use the N-word.
Oh yeah.
And that the New York Times said, it doesn't matter, the context is irrelevant. And the example I think I put in the piece, I don't know if it got cut from my piece, was that I love this a friend of mine who's a brilliant songwriter named Tim Minchin, wrote a wonderful piece called I think it's called Prejudice or something like that, where he says, beginning the song, he talks about I don't want to hurt people, and there's a word we can't use. That has two G's and an I and an N and an E and an R, and he goes on about it, and then halfway through the song he turns into saying only gingers can call other people gingers, because he's in Australia and he's redhead, and gingers is a broad word, but everyone is assuming he's talking about the other word. And right. Anytime a word becomes, nothing should be sacred. Nothing should be beyond questioning. And anytime any group turns something into sacred, even a profane word, making it sacred because you're saying somehow that the use of any word can somehow destroy someone. Well, the use of words can hurt people, but people can also get above that. And the fact that Stephen Fry, who I've been on my podcast and is a friend of mine, has said very often that, giving offense, causing offense, that's the person who owns that is the person who's offended, and how they deal with it is what's important. Whether they deal with it, go up to someone and say, "Excuse me, you offended me. Here's a reason, and we should talk about this," or whether you ignore it and say that person's an idiot, or I'm not worrying what they say, or whether you then decide 5 years later that you've been offended and that person should therefore not be allowed to exist. Being offended gives you no special rights. And this notion that single words can somehow destroy people, that the word, rape can't be mentioned in class, or some fear some person will be triggered, is worrisome, because, part of education is facing things that are not comfortable, that otherwise you're not learning. Yeah,
I don't know if Ricky Gervais was talking to you where I saw this, or someone else, but Ricky Gervais was. Yeah, it might be you, because he said that, and I'm just going to paraphrase. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something like, and that's like a person walking up to a tree and seeing a post for guitar lessons and taking the number and calling them and just being like, how dare you teach guitar lessons, because they really offend you.
I don't want guitar lessons. I mean,
Yeah.
okay, that's right. He did that in my podcast. And it's exactly that way. And unfortunately it's pervasive. And for me as an educator, it's what's most sad is it's infiltrated higher education, so that literally higher education isn't in many cases education anymore, because certain concepts cannot be discussed, literally cannot be discussed. And the minute the things that can't be discussed, you're hindering education.
That's why those grievances papers were so alarming to me. Was that Helen Pluckrose, I think her name is?
Yeah, Helen Pluckrose, and I think James Lindsay, and maybe Peter Boghossian.
Yeah. Do you have enough background on that to explain to our audience what that is? Because a lot of people might not know. And I thought it was just like the most perfect way to sort of, expose academia.
Well, they've done a number of things. So the one I'm most familiar with is the spoof papers that they published in a variety of journals, which were ridiculous. And I think their point was, they were arguing that in many gender studies journals, that the standards of academic integrity, if you want to call it that, are so low that any nonsense can be published. And the notion was, and then they got, they got in trouble for publishing spoof papers. But at least I think Peter Boghossian did, because they made up one of them was about rape and dog
rape culture and homophobia and dogs
in these dog playgrounds, and I think they got in trouble from their grievance studies, but because they didn't do they basically claimed to have done a survey they didn't do among dogs and dog owners, and they've done a very important job, I think, in pointing out, that again, any field that claims to make presumptions that are not based empirically is a field that is worrisome. And certain fields are so and that's becoming the case in academia, where basically academia itself is so there are presumptions that are made that inhibit the ability to have human intellectual intercourse to be able to have open critical discussions, which is what's required for learning in academia. And anyone, and right now, I think some of the grievance studies they've done is that basically anyone who fear of having grievances be called out are causing universities to basically stop having any discussion of anything controversial, or anything that anyone, it may not even be controversial, but that someone thinks is controversial, because the media right now, the internet and social media are such that a small group of vocal people can have a profound influence, especially, and this is the saddest thing, when the leaders, academic leaders or government leaders or leaders of scientific organizations, when they have no intellectual backbone, when they say a small group of people speaking up is enough, if they look at it and they say, what's the downside of infringing on academic freedom or censoring ideas? Well, the downside is, well, we may hurt some individuals, but we stop the social media outcry, and by stopping social media outcry, we don't put the donations and public support in jeopardy, or government support in jeopardy. And so, rather than standing up in favor of intellectual integrity and free speech and free inquiry, the leaders of many universities and government agencies and scientific institutions are caving in. And that's exactly what has happened various other times in the communist scare and other times. And this too shall pass, but it's sad because it's hurting a generation of students because they're not being able to be educated. And that's
I'm actually not so sure it's going to pass. Like, I hope it passes. It feels like a lot of this stuff should collapse under the weight of its own stupidity.
It's not going to pass soon. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But these things all pass. Okay, they're, you know, and it may be replaced by something worse. So don't worry about it. You know, I mean, but I think social movements evolve, and if history is any guide, this will pass. And as Mark Twain once said, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it sure rhymes a lot.
Yeah, that's right. So history is a rapper at the end of the day. I don't know how to approach the subject because a lot of people will just see two white guys talking about it, which normally doesn't bother me at all. But I want to just be careful only because I don't want to just be dismissive. I do want to talk a little bit about critical race theory, because the more I read about that, the more I look at it and I'm just like, I'm having a hard time believing that a lot of the components of critical race theory are even real. Like, it wasn't part of a grievance study spoof paper, because they list things that are defined as white supremacy, like being on time, being a perfectionist.
We don't have to have this discussion. I mean, it's ridiculous. I think I don't, you know, it's not, I used to say when I criticized superstring theory that it did a disservice to the term theory. But it's not on a level of critical race theory. I mean, calling it a theory is in a scientific sense is just an absurd and abuse of that word. And everything I know and have seen about it means that it's just an excuse to censor. It's the fundamental basis of it, as I understand it and as I've seen it in action, is the same as the witch trials in Salem, where if you basically said you weren't a witch, you were a witch. And there's no way out. And so, you know,
but is it dangerous?
You can have people who've studied, and you can have Helen Puckrose and others who've studied in much more detail and have much more intellectually deep views of critical race theory. But this notion that white supremacy, being on time, or as a group in California who are basically changing the math standards, have said that getting the right answer in a math test is an example of white supremacy, and that's a disservice to everybody.
I don't even understand the idea behind the statement. Right?
Well, I think there are motivations behind it. Look, the motivation
are they trying to make a historical point that access to education was, you know?
Well, I think the point is that there has been racism in this country and in Canada and other countries, and so people will say, okay, well, there has been racism, and there have been times when racism has impacted on things, but then they extrapolate, and then they therefore say racism is inherent in every aspect of the society, which is just not true. Science is not racist. It's just not. It's based on questioning anything, and there's no inherent racism in mathematics. But the motivation one can understand is an anger and a sense of being left out, a sense of inequity ultimately, and there are inequities that are real in society, so we can't pretend they're not there. But to suggest they're everywhere is to do a disservice to everyone.
Yeah, I'd like to pivot for a second, just based on what you said about how we're all sort of been racist in our past. I don't know if you've heard since you've been up here, or even before you left, about the 215 bodies.
I just read about it this today. I'm trying to get Canadian news now that I'm up here. And again, let me get more people hating me, I guess. Okay. I just read in the paper that in Prince Edward Island, where I happen to be at the moment, that they're taking down this statue of Sir John A. Macdonald. Now, I'm sure I studied Canadian history, okay, so I know Sir John A. Macdonald was not a great guy, but to somehow argue that you know, the history of Canada and the United States and Australia, countries all of which I've lived in, is certainly based on certain groups taking away the rights of other groups. So if you want to go back, there's zero doubt that Native Americans or Indigenous peoples, or the Indigenous peoples in Australia, were forcibly removed from land. They were screwed in many other ways. Fine, okay. But if you're going to suggest, therefore, that every individual who was, and that the first prime minister of this country, Canada, can't have a statue. I just don't. I mean, I don't understand it, because everyone is. You can't have a statue for anyone. Okay, just take them all down. Have no statues for anybody. Have no celebration of the things you think are good, because maybe you like Canada now, and you say somehow the first prime minister of Canada represents the creation of a country that you like, and let me celebrate that. But I don't understand. I understand that this was a real serious, awful thing that happened, and we should discuss it, and we should own up to it, and we should explore it and investigate it and see what can be done to ensure that the lessons of the past cause a better future than the past. But using it to basically cancel everyone just doesn't seem to me to be of any useful purpose.
Yeah, I'm not really for toppling statues and things like that. Maybe though there's a compromise where, we have a habit of putting kind of bad people's names on something that's prominent. Like a statue would be a symbol of prominence. Putting a name on a school, that's a symbol of prominence. Maybe we don't erase the history, but we take away the prominence part. We can have a bust and then a plaque.
How do you determine that? I mean, this is the question. That someone was bad. I mean, that, okay. I mean, if you come down to it, you're not going to be able to name anything after anyone. And so, okay, we won't have names anymore. Fine. But I mean, you can always find things that people have done that anyone's done that you disagree with or you dislike. Is that going to be a reason? And so you might say there's some threshold, and we used to have a logical threshold. You say if they were, it was sort of accepted at some level who, you wouldn't name things after, but it's kind of arbitrary. And it's like, and we have to realize that history is done that way. I mean, I remember, as you've seen, I've talked a lot to my friend Noam Chomsky about these things, but he would have worked with, there's a good history book in the United States called A People's History in the United States by Howard Zinn, who's pointed out that the people we normally, the names that we remember in history are usually the people who were pretty bad. Okay. And okay, so great. So we recognize that fact, and we should educate people that fact. But Sir John A. Macdonald was the first prime minister of Canada. That's a fact. And if we like, and if the creation of that country is something that we want to celebrate in one way or another, then the person who you may have done bad things, but he was involved in the legislation that helped, and the creation of a country, and we either celebrate that or we don't. But I don't see that condemning John A. Macdonald for what happened in I think it was Kamloops, I forget where, but it seems yeah, I'm sure he was a prick, but okay, fine,
I think what the residential school thing, what makes it especially kind of heinous, and it's not, and I'm not even like, I wasn't even going to mention Johnny MacDonald, to be honest. They actually cut the head off the Ryerson statue at Ryerson University because he was apparently the architect of the educational material at the residential schools. Well, anyway, those schools, they kidnapped Indigenous children, and they existed, by the way, until the 90s. Not the kidnapping.
Yeah, I know, and it's horrendous. It's awful. It's awful. And so we accept it's awful, but what we should really be doing is asking, what can we do to ensure that kind of thing doesn't happen, and not lose track of saying, well, what we're really going to do is cut the heads off statues. That's irrelevant and unimportant. And I personally, I guess when I think about my own life, I've had some relationship. I remember when I was young and I was nominated for a Rhodes Scholarship, I didn't want to I chose to go to the United States. I didn't want to go to ultimately to England anyway, partly because of Cecil Rhodes and the tradition that he was involved in. So that was a personal choice. I think, there were lots of factors, and I think the happiest thing for me that I took a Rhodes Scholarship ultimately was that I didn't do philosophy, which is what I was thinking of doing there, and I chose to go to the United States and do physics instead. But we all make these personal things, but I do think it's sidetracks. We can always find scapegoats, and all of the people, many of the people. Maybe there are people who are without sin. Maybe there are people who've not been involved in it. But when I see another example in the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Okay, he's being removed. They want to remove his name from high schools. Why? Well, he did something pretty good when it came to slavery, but when it came to Native Americans, he was not so good. So okay, but ultimately, what you're doing is you're denigrating someone who, in spite of those actions, did something incredibly important and good for the country, and saying that he's of no value because he also did something that was bad. And you're confusing, it seems to me, and defusing an issue. That was a real problem. The whole notion of what was done was problematic and should be openly discussed and debated, and debated with even some people. If people say, well, maybe there were good reasons for it, and I'm sure you'd be vilified if you even said that. But open debate is what I think is important, and ultimately the whole purpose of it is to produce a society that is ultimately healthier, rather than using it as an opportunity to find scapegoats, which just distract from the central issue. That's in my opinion. I'm sure.
I actually tend to agree with that. Where I was going to go with the residential school thing was the Catholic Church, because they ran them, right?
Yeah, I know the Catholic Church, but we all know the Catholic Church is horrendous, right?
No, but okay. So what I was going to say though is that in Canada, the story comes out, the 215 bodies comes out. The Catholic Church once again is at the center because they ran the school. And then where I wanted to pivot to from there is this question of, why does the Catholic Church still exist? One. And two, if I may borrow an idea from Christopher Hitchens, why can't we invade the Vatican? Well, look, they seem like a state that's led by pedophile and murder. Like seriously, I'm not. This is, if they were an international chain of daycare centers, if they were like a shoe store, if they were anything but a religion,
Well, that's the problem. The problem with religion. I've been in the Vatican. I've been at the Pontifical Academy in the Vatican and stayed at the Vatican and on one occasion. But why is the Catholic Church still in existence? Because people want to believe, and it's incredibly powerful, and they control the minds of children. That's the point. Because parents allow their children. I mean, I've said religion is a form of child abuse in that sense. You imbue these things in children who are too young to understand the deep intellectual issues associated with a creator and all these things. And once it's here, you can't get out of here. And so I think that's the really reason they continue to exist, because religions are smart enough to get parents to brainwash their children early enough on. So even when the children overcome it, there's still vestiges that remain. And it's incredibly powerful. And in some places, it's the only institution that enforces any order in a society. And in fact, in some places, the Catholic Church is involved with helping people. And so that's
So is Hamas.
What?
So is Hamas.
Well, yeah, I know. And if you've heard me talk to Noam Chomsky, you'll point out that liberation theology was in South America. The Catholic, there were priests who were the only people basically trying to defend people against dictatorships in a lot of South America. So there's nothing that's cut and dry about all of this. And that's the problem. By labeling scapegoats or anything like that, you demean and diminish the whole debate, and which is sometimes more complex and needs to be openly discussed. And I don't know how long you're planning to go. I got a message. I have to report in for my quarantine. And I got a call from the government saying they couldn't get through to me, and I need to report in, and so I'm obliged in some sense pretty soon to get off there and call back.
No, that's totally fine. Wait, can you tell us about your book? It's coming out soon, isn't it? It's not, according to ours. Okay, I just checked.
I always have a book coming out soon. I'm working on a new book, but my book, The Physics of Climate Change, came out in March. In paper, in hardcover, in the United States and Canada, and what it is it tries to do what should be done, I think, which is it discusses the science, not policy. The climate change has become enmeshed in all sorts of political obfuscation, and the left and the right are using it differently, and what really is important as the basis of sound public policy is to ask what the empirical facts are. And so this is a book to show that, in fact, anyone can understand the fundamental basis of climate change. That it's not sure, there are complex supercomputer models that you need to discuss ocean currents in Europe, maybe, but to understand the fundamental basis of greenhouse, of what's called the greenhouse effect, which is misnamed, I should say. Anyone can understand it, just like my book, The Physics of Star Trek, said you can understand modern science. And it's fascinating, and that this can then be the basis of later on discussions of public policy, but we should all at least understand what the facts are, and that the science can allow you to make predictions, and that anyone with a high school education has enough training to be able to basically see the fundamental physics. And it's fascinating. And so it was fun for me to write it. And one of the things we've done, by the way, just finished this week, was sending copies to every member of the U.S. Congress, hopefully, so that this can be the basis of public policy. But it's available in principle in the United States and Canada. And because the science of, when I wrote it, some publishers didn't want to publish it because they said, well, you've got to make it doomsday. You've got to get it emotional. And it's unfortunate to me that and that's why one of the reasons why it's doing, people are buying it, which is nice, in spite of the fact that it has no media, no interviews in the major media, no book reviews or anything, which is interesting. And there are a number of reasons for that, but one of them is that it basically tries not to sensationalize the issue.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that minds like yourselves and Professor Chomsky, when I was talking to him not too long ago, also has a book out about the environment. Listening to Chomsky talk about the environment in 2021 is like listening to him talk about like American imperialism in like 1978. Like, you know what I mean? He's all in. It's nice.
I'll advertise. I've done, as you know, podcasts with Noam Chomsky, but we're also doing now a regular series on my podcast called Current Events with Noam Chomsky. So we've released two or three, and there's another one coming out every week or so. He and I talk for 10 or 15 minutes about some things.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, it was a treat to talk to him.
Larence Krauss, I should say.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, it was an honor to talk to him, and to you, sir. I'm sorry that we don't have more time, but you better get on that quarantine.
It's that government imposing their rules on me, but in this case,
where is your liberty, Larence?
Yeah, well, I suppose in this case, part of the social contract. We're born free, but we live forever in chains, and I don't mind this particular chain, so I'm going to phone the government back. Okay.
Professor Larence Krauss, everybody. Sir, thanks again for coming on Blackballed. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks again. Thanks for having me.
That was Larence Krauss. Guys, I didn't prepare because physics is something I have a really hard time understanding. I was going to start talking to Larence about free will, and I can't do that. I find that topic so frustrating. It makes me feel like I have no choices in life. Big show on the Dean Blundell show today, by the way. Everyone's favorite activist, Chris Sky, will be on the show to tell us how many feet long are his teeth. And we will talk to everybody then. Thanks very much, guys.